The morning coffee grows cold in Margaret Thompson's trembling hands as she stares at her phone. The words from her son David's girlfriend echoing through her mind like shattered glass, cutting through comfortable assumptions about family relationships and communication that 30 years of motherhood had established through patterns that seemed unbreakable until this moment, when casual question about wedding plans receives answer that transforms anticipated celebration in a fait accompli that excludes the woman who had raised him, nurtured his dreams, and assumed her role in his most important life decisions remained secure despite growing distance that romance creates between mothers and sons, when new love demands primary allegiance that maturity requires, but hearts struggle accepting when bonds forged through sacrifice suddenly face competition for relationships, that passion builds through choices that exclude rather than include the people whose unconditional love provided. Foundation for growth, that independence eventually requires abandoning through transitions that wisdom understands, but emotions resist when transformation means redefining connections that identity had assumed would remain constant despite evidence that love evolves through stages that sometimes require separation before new forms of intimacy can develop between souls who choose different definitions of family when circumstances demand adaptation that courage must provide despite fear that change inevitably creates. David, I was just calling to check about the wedding venue availability, Margaret says into her phone, her voice carrying the efficient warmth of a mother who has spent months helping plan what she assumed would be her family's celebration of the century. Mom, about that. David's voice carries hesitation that immediately sets off maternal alarm bells, his tone suggesting complications that careful planning should have prevented when organization had been her specialty throughout his childhood. Is there a problem with the booking? Because I called 3 backup locations just in case, and I have the contact information right here in my wedding planning binder. Margaret responds quickly, her mind already shifting into problem-solving mode that crisis management had taught her. No, Mom, it's not about venues, David interrupts gently, his words creating pause that confusion fills when expected information doesn't arrive according to established patterns that communication had followed for decades. Then what's wrong? You sound strange, honey. Are you having second thoughts about the ceremony size? Because we can adjust the guest list if Sarah feels overwhelmed by the planning process. Margaret continues, her concern focused on logistics rather than possibility that fundamental assumptions might be incorrect. Mom, please just listen for a minute. David requests with firmness that adulthood had developed despite her continued tendency to manage his decisions when maternal instincts override recognition that grown children require space for independent choices. Of course, sweetheart. What's bothering you about the wedding plans? She responds, settling into her favorite armchair where countless family conversations had occurred throughout years when his problems could be solved through advice that experience provided. Sarah and we got married yesterday, David announces quietly, his words creating silence that shock produces when reality refuses to conform to expectations that preparation had created around events that inclusion was supposed to define rather than exclusion determining participation. What do you mean you got married yesterday? Margaret asks with confusion that genuine disbelief creates when information contradicts established plans that months of effort had developed around celebration, that family involvement was supposed to coordinate through collaboration rather than unilateral decisions. The silence stretches between them like chasm opening between worlds. One where family decisions involve consultation and consideration, another where independence requires proving autonomy through choices that deliberately exclude input from people whose opinions had previously mattered when childhood dependence created different dynamics than adult relationships established through boundaries that growth demands. We had a small ceremony at the courthouse, David explains carefully, his words revealing planning that had occurred without her knowledge despite months of conversations about wedding preparations that she had assumed included accurate information about timeline and decision-making processes. The courthouse. Margaret repeats with disbelief that sacred family moment had been reduced to bureaucratic transaction rather than celebration that generations could remember through ceremonies that honor relationships alongside legal formalities that marriage requires, but love transcends through rituals that meaning creates. It was beautiful, Mom. Simple and perfect for us, David continues, his defense revealing that criticism was anticipated despite joy that authentic love should create when commitment finds expression through forms that couples choose rather than accepting expectations that tradition imposes. But we had plans, David. The church is booked, the caterer has been paid deposits, your grandmother's dress has been altered for Sarah, the invitations are already printed. Margaret's voice rises with each item that preparation had completed toward event that no longer exists in form she had envisioned. I know, and I'm sorry about the deposits and arrangements. We'll handle all the financial aspects, obviously. David responds with responsibility that maturity demonstrates when choices create consequences that accountability must address despite emotional costs that decisions inevitably produce. This isn't about money, David. This is about family, about including the people who love you in the most important day of your life. Margaret exclaims, her pain evident as exclusion creates wounds that money cannot heal when relationships require recognition rather than just financial consideration. Mom, please try to understand. We wanted something intimate, just the two of us making promises without all the pressure and expectations that big weddings create. David explains, his reasoning revealing perspective that her involvement had been experienced as burden rather than blessing. Pressure? Is that what you call your family wanting to celebrate your happiness? Margaret asks with hurt that betrayal creates when love gets redefined as obligation rather than gift that sacrifice had provided throughout years when devotion seemed appreciated rather than burdensome. Mrs. Thompson. Sarah's voice comes through the phone as David apparently hands over conversation to bride whose relationship with future mother-in-law had seemed positive during months of wedding planning that now reveals itself as elaborate deception rather than genuine collaboration. Sarah, honey, is this really what you wanted? To get married without family present? Margaret asks with hope that daughter-in-law might provide different perspective that could explain decisions that seem calculated to wound rather than celebrate love that should unite rather than divide families. Actually, it was my idea, Sarah admits honestly, her confession creating new layer of betrayal that Margaret struggles to process when blame shifts from son's impulsiveness to calculated choice by woman she had welcomed in a family through generous inclusion. Your idea? But we've been planning this wedding for 8 months. You seemed excited about every detail, from the flowers to the menu tasting. Margaret responds with confusion that deception creates when trust gets violated through sustained performance rather than honest communication. I was trying to be polite, Mrs. Thompson, but honestly, the whole big wedding thing felt overwhelming and not really about David and me, Sarah explains, her words revealing that months of collaboration had been endured rather than enjoyed despite enthusiasm that she had performed convincingly. Not about you, Sarah. Every single decision was made with your preferences in mind. I asked your opinion about everything from table linens to music selection. Margaret protests, her memory of inclusive planning contradicting Sarah's characterization of process as imposed rather than collaborative. I know you meant well, but it felt more like your dream wedding than ours. The fancy venue, the elaborate menu, the guest list of people we barely know. It was all very traditional and formal. Sarah continues, her criticism revealing that style preferences had been interpreted as requirements rather than suggestions. Traditional? You say that like it's something shameful. I thought we were creating beautiful memories that would last a lifetime. Margaret responds defensively, her values under attack when tradition gets dismissed rather than honored through ceremonies that meaning creates across generations. And we have beautiful memories now from our wedding yesterday. It was perfect for us, just David and me, exchanging vows that we wrote ourselves in a setting that felt authentic rather than performative, Sarah explains, her happiness evident despite exclusion that her joy had required creating. Performative. Margaret repeats with pain that characterization creates when lifetime of family celebrations get reduced to theater rather than genuine expressions of love that community sharing had made meaningful through participation that belonging requires. Mrs. Thompson, I don't mean to hurt you, But planning a wedding for 300 people we barely interact with, spending $60,000 on one day, requiring months of stress and coordination. That felt more like producing an event than celebrating our relationship, Sarah elaborates, her perspective revealing different values than Margaret had assumed they shared. Those people are family and friends who care about you both. And the money wasn't the point. It was about showing how much this moment means to everyone who loves you. Margaret explains, her reasoning reflecting worldview, where celebration serves community rather than just couple when relationships exist within networks that support requires nurturing. I understand that's important to you, and maybe if we had grown up in the same social circles, it would feel important to us too. But David and I wanted something that reflected our values rather than expectations we couldn't relate to, Sarah continues, her words revealing class differences that wedding planning had not successfully bridged despite attempts at inclusion. What values? The value of shutting out family? The value of making decisions in secret? The value of letting people who love you find out about major life events after they're over? Margaret's voice breaks with emotion that betrayal creates when exclusion becomes deliberate rather than accidental. The values of authenticity, simplicity, and making choices based on what feels right for us rather than what other people expect. Sarah responds firmly, her conviction suggesting the decision had been carefully considered rather than impulsive despite timing that seems sudden. And what about the value of including people who have supported you, who want to share in your joy, who have earned the right to be part of important moments through years of love and care? Margaret asks, her question challenging definition of authenticity that excludes rather than includes community participation. Mrs. Thompson, I respect that those values matter to you. But David and I had to choose what mattered most to us. And that was having a wedding that felt true to who we are rather than meeting expectations that felt foreign to our experience. Sarah explains, her diplomacy unable to soften reality that different backgrounds had created incompatible visions. Well, you certainly got what you wanted, Margaret responds bitterly, her words carrying resignation that defeat creates when all arguments have been exhausted without changing outcomes that seem designed to wound rather than celebrate love, that should unite families rather than dividing them through choices that exclude rather than include. Mom, are you still there? David's voice returns to conversation after whispered discussion that background noise suggests between newlyweds who must navigate between individual happiness and family relationships, that marriage affects beyond just couple when decisions create ripple effects throughout networks that connection had established over decades. I'm here, David, Margaret responds wearily, her tone carrying exhaustion that emotional shock creates when fundamental assumptions about relationships get challenged through revelations that trusted communication had been facade rather than authentic sharing of thoughts and plans. I know you're hurt, and I hate that. But I hope you can understand that this wasn't about rejecting you or the family. It was about us creating something that felt authentic to our relationship. David explains, his words seeking forgiveness for choices that consideration might have prevented if consultation had been attempted. Authentic? David, lying to me for months about your plans, letting me spend time and energy and emotional investment in celebration that you had already decided wasn't going to happen. What's authentic about that? Margaret challenges, her question revealing that deception rather than decision creates deepest wound. You're right. And I'm sorry about the deception. We should have been honest about our feelings earlier in the planning process. David admits, his acknowledgement providing accountability, but not repair for damage that trust violation had created through sustained dishonesty rather than difficult conversation. Earlier? David, you should have been honest from the beginning. If you didn't want the wedding we were planning, why didn't you tell me that instead of letting me believe we were working together towards something you actually resented? Margaret's voice carries pain that betrayal creates when love gets manipulated rather than trusted. Because I knew you'd be disappointed, and I didn't want to hurt you, David explains, his motivation revealing pattern that conflict avoidance had created when difficult conversations get postponed until decisions make discussion irrelevant rather than inclusive. So, instead you decided to hurt me much more deeply by excluding me completely. Margaret asks, her logic revealing how protection from disappointment had escalated into devastation that exclusion creates when love gets shut out rather than challenged to adapt. It wasn't supposed to hurt you this much. We thought you'd be happy that we were married and that the details of how it happened wouldn't matter as much as the fact that we're committed to each other. David continues, his miscalculation evident in assumption that process matters less than outcome when relationships require recognition to feel valued. The details of how it happened are that my son got married without telling me, that I found out about one of the most important days of his life after it was over, that months of planning and excitement were based on lies. Margaret summarizes, her words making clear that method creates meaning when exclusion defines experience more than celebration. I understand why you see it that way, but from our perspective, we were trying to avoid all the stress and complications that big weddings create. We've seen too many couples get so caught up in planning the perfect event that they lose sight of what marriage is actually about. Sarah's voice returns to conversation, her explanation revealing philosophy that celebration distract from commitment rather than enhancing meaning through community witness. And what is marriage about, Sarah? Because I thought it was about joining families, not just two individuals. I thought it was about community support for a relationship that's going to face challenges that need more than just two people to overcome. Margaret responds, her understanding of marriage as social institution rather than just personal contract creating conflict with their individualistic approach. For us, marriage is about our commitment to each other, our promises to support each other's growth, our decision to build a life together based on shared values. Sarah explains, her definition focused on couple rather than extended relationships that traditional marriage ceremonies acknowledge through family involvement. Those are beautiful sentiments, but marriage isn't just about feelings between two people. It's about creating new family connections, about children having grandparents who feel included, about building support systems that last beyond romance. Margaret argues, her perspective reflecting understanding that relationships exist within networks rather than isolation. We want those family connections, Mrs. Thompson. We want our children to have close relationships with their grandparents. But we also needed to start our marriage in a way that felt authentic to us rather than performing roles that didn't fit our personalities. Sarah continues, her words suggesting that inclusion and authenticity had been viewed as incompatible rather than achievable through communication. Authentic to you apparently means excluding people who love you. Margaret observes bitterly, her summary reducing their choice to selfishness rather than recognizing values differences that created incompatible visions for celebration that compromise might have addressed if attempted. Mrs. Thompson, I know this is painful for you, and I'm genuinely sorry about that. We never wanted to hurt you. We just wanted to get married in a way that felt right for us, Sarah repeats. Her apology sincere, but insufficient for repair when damage extends beyond hurt feelings and a fundamental breach of trust that relationship repair requires addressing. Well, you got married in a way that felt right for you. Margaret concludes with finality that resignation creates when all arguments have been exhausted without achieving understanding that might lead to healing, when wounds this deep require time and effort that forgiveness demands but pride might resist providing. 3 days after the revelation, Margaret sits in her therapist's office, the wedding planning binder on the table between them like evidence of betrayal that professional guidance must help her process when family relationships require healing that individual effort cannot achieve without perspective that experience provides. Dr. Williams, I don't understand how I could have been so wrong about everything. I thought we were close, that he trusted me, that my opinions mattered to him. Margaret explains, her confusion evident as fundamental assumptions about motherhood get challenged through exclusion that seemed calculated rather than necessary. Margaret, it sounds like the situation involves several different layers of hurt. Can you help me understand what feels most painful about how this unfolded? Dr. Williams asks, her question guiding exploration of emotions that complexity makes difficult to untangle when multiple wounds exist simultaneously. The lying hurts the most, Margaret admits after consideration. If they had told me from the beginning that they wanted something small and private, I would have been disappointed, but I could have respected their choice. The deception makes me question everything about our relationship. That's understandable. Trust is fundamental to close relationships. And when we discover that someone has been withholding important information, it can feel like the entire foundation has shifted, Dr. Williams validates. Her response acknowledging that reaction contains logic rather than just emotional overresponse. Exactly. And now, I don't know what else they might have been hiding, what other decisions they've made without including me, what other lies they've told to avoid difficult conversations. Margaret continues, her anxiety revealing how single deception creates broader uncertainty about communication patterns. Have there been other instances where you felt excluded from David's important decisions? The therapist inquires, seeking pattern that might explain current situation rather than viewing it as isolated incident that solutions could address through single conversation. Not like this, but looking back, I can see signs that he's been pulling away. Shorter phone calls, less detail about his life, declining invitations to family events. Margaret realizes her hindsight identifying gradual process rather than sudden change in relationship dynamics. It's common for adult children to establish more independence as they prepare for marriage. Sometimes this process involves creating boundaries that parents experience as rejection, even when that's not the intention. Dr. Williams explains, her perspective offering framework for understanding behavior that personal experience makes difficult to interpret objectively. But boundaries should involve communication, not deception. If he needed space, he could have asked for it instead of pretending everything was fine while secretly planning to exclude me from one of the most important days of his life. Margaret protests, her logic revealing that method rather than outcome creates primary grievance. You're absolutely right that healthy boundaries require honest communication. It sounds like David and Sarah chose avoidance over difficult conversation, which created much more pain than direct discussion might have caused. The therapist agrees, validating Margaret's perspective while acknowledging that better alternatives existed. So what do I do now? How do I rebuild trust with someone who chose to lie rather than deal with my potential disappointment? Margaret asks, her question revealing desire for relationship repair despite wounds that current anger reflects through hurt that love makes possible. That's a process that will require effort from both sides. You'll need to decide whether you can forgive the deception while they'll need to acknowledge the harm it caused and commit to different communication patterns going forward. Dr. Williams explains, outlining path that healing demands when relationships face damage that time alone cannot repair. What if they don't think they did anything wrong? Sarah seemed to believe that authenticity justified excluding family, and David acted like hurt feelings were unreasonable response to being lied to. Margaret observes, her concern reflecting that forgiveness requires acknowledgement that some responses suggest might not be forthcoming. Those are important considerations. Relationship repair requires both parties to acknowledge legitimate concerns and work toward solutions that honor everyone's needs. If they're unwilling to recognize the impact of their choices, rebuilding trust becomes much more difficult. The therapist admits honestly, I want to have a relationship with them, and I definitely want to be part of any grandchildren's lives. But I can't pretend that this didn't happen or that it's okay to treat family this way. Margaret states, her position balancing love with self-respect when compromise requires boundaries that protect against future harm. That's a healthy approach. You can love someone while also setting limits about how you're willing to be treated. The question becomes how to communicate those boundaries in ways that invite connection rather than creating more distance. Dr. Williams guides, her suggestion offering direction for conversations that relationship preservation requires. I suppose I need to have another conversation with them, but this time focusing on future communication rather than relitigating past decisions. Margaret concludes, her insight revealing that forward movement requires different approach than blame assignment that anger might prefer, but healing cannot achieve. 2 weeks later, Margaret calls David, her prepared words feeling inadequate for conversation that relationship repair requires when pride must yield to love without abandoning self-respect, that boundaries demand for sustainable connection when wounds need healing rather than just temporary peace that avoidance might provide. Hi, Mom. David answers cautiously, his tone revealing awareness that previous conversation had ended badly despite hope that time might have improved emotional climate. that forgiveness could create if attempted with mutual respect. Hello, David. I've been thinking about our last conversation, and I'd like to try again if you're willing. Margaret begins carefully, her approach reflecting therapeutic guidance about focusing on future possibilities rather than past grievances that blame might emphasize, but resolution requires transcending. I like that too, Mom. Sarah and I have been talking about how we handled things, and we realize we could have made better choices about communication. David responds, his acknowledgement creating foundation for dialogue that accountability makes possible when mistakes receive recognition rather than justification. I appreciate that, honey. I've been working on understanding your perspective too, and I can see how our planning process might have felt overwhelming rather than inclusive. Margaret admits, her growth evident in capacity for self-reflection that defensive reactions might prevent, but healing demands when relationships require mutual understanding. It did feel overwhelming sometimes, but that doesn't excuse lying to you about our plans. We should have been honest about our feelings instead of letting you invest time and energy in something we weren't committed to. David continues, his responsibility taking encouraging further dialogue. Thank you for acknowledging that. The deception hurt more than the actual decision would have, because it made me question whether I really know you anymore. Margaret explains, her vulnerability creating opportunity for deeper connection if met with empathy rather than defensiveness. I'm sorry, Mom. You do know me, and you've been an amazing mother. We made poor choices about communication because we were afraid of disappointing you. But that's not your fault. It's ours, David clarifies, his response demonstrating maturity that blame deflection might prevent, but ownership enables. I need to ask you something important, David. Are you happy? Was this really what you wanted? Or did you feel pressured into eloping because the traditional wedding seemed too complicated? Margaret inquires, her concern for his well-being overriding ego that might focus on personal injury rather than son's authentic desires. I'm very happy, Mom. Marrying Sarah was absolutely what I wanted, and our small ceremony felt perfect for us. I just wish we had found a way to include you in some form without compromising what felt authentic about our relationship. David responds, his honesty revealing that satisfaction with choice coexists with regret about method. What would inclusion have looked like if you had designed it? Margaret asks, genuinely curious about possibilities that creativity might have discovered if communication had preceded decision rather than following irreversible action that exclusion had created. Maybe a small ceremony with just immediate family, or a bigger reception later to celebrate with everyone who want to share our joy. There were probably lots of options we didn't explore because we got stuck thinking it had to be either your vision or our vision instead of finding compromise. David admits, his insight revealing that problem-solving had been abandoned prematurely. I would have been open to different arrangements if I had known you were struggling with the plans we were making. Communication works both ways, and I should have checked in more about how you were feeling rather than assuming your silence meant agreement. Margaret acknowledges, her growth evident in recognizing that inclusiveness requires active verification rather than passive assumption. Can we start over with this, Mom? Not the marriage, obviously, but the family part of it? Sarah and I would like to have some kind of celebration where we can share our joy with everyone who cares about us. David proposes, his suggestion offering path forward that past mistakes need not prevent if forgiveness enables new possibilities. I would love that, David, but I need us to agree on better communication going forward. If you're unhappy about something, please tell me directly rather than pretending everything is fine. I can handle disappointment much better than deception. Margaret requests, her boundary reasonable and necessary for trust rebuilding. That's fair, and I promise to be more honest about my feelings even when difficult conversations feel uncomfortable. We want you to be part of our lives, Mom, and that requires trust that honest communication can build if we're both committed to it. David agrees, his commitment creating foundation for improved relationship. Then let's plan a reception that reflects who you both are while including the people who love you. I promise to listen more and assume less. Margaret concludes, her words carrying hope that family relationships can heal through choices that honor both individual authenticity and community connection when love guides compromise rather than pride preventing adaptation. 6 months later, The garden reception unfolds with intimate beauty that compromise had created when love guided planning rather than competing visions, determining celebration that includes everyone while honoring couples' values through ceremony that authenticity and tradition can share when communication enables understanding rather than assumptions creating conflict. Margaret, this is absolutely perfect, Sarah says genuinely, her appreciation evident as setting reflects their preferences while including family involvement that exclusion had previously prevented when fear of overwhelm led to elimination rather than modification that creativity could have provided. I'm so glad you're happy with it, sweetheart. It means everything to see you and David celebrating with all the people who love you. Margaret responds warmly, her joy authentic as relationship repair had enabled participation that healing makes possible when forgiveness guides choices rather than resentment preventing connection. Thank you for being so understanding about our unconventional approach to getting married. I know it wasn't what you envisioned, but your willingness to work with us on this reception has meant so much, Sarah continues, her gratitude reflecting recognition that grace had been extended despite wounds that justified less generous response. Families find ways to love each other through all kinds of circumstances. Sarah, what matters is that we keep talking and working together instead of letting pride keep us apart. Margaret replies, her wisdom earned through experience that relationship preservation requires effort from all parties when conflict arises. I love that our children will grow up knowing their grandmother values both tradition and individual expression, Sarah observes, her comment revealing that future generations benefit when adults model compromise rather than rigid adherence to single viewpoints that accommodation could improve. Speaking of children, David interrupts with excitement that announcement creates. We wanted you to be among the first to know that Sarah is pregnant. We found out yesterday, and this time we're sharing the news immediately. Margaret's eyes fill with tears that joy produces when exclusion transforms into inclusion through choices that honor family relationships alongside individual preferences. Her emotional response reflecting gratitude that communication improvement had enabled participation rather than repeat exclusion. Oh my goodness, a grandchild! She exclaims with delight that grandparenthood anticipation creates when family bonds heal sufficiently to include future generations in celebration rather than allowing past wounds to prevent ongoing connection that love makes possible through forgiveness. We're hoping you'll be very involved in this baby's life, Mom. We've learned that trying to do everything ourselves isn't necessary or healthy when family support is available. David explains, his perspective matured through experience that isolation provides less satisfaction than connection when approached with appropriate boundaries. The reception continues with laughter that authentic celebration creates when joy gets shared among people who choose love over pride, when relationships face challenges that communication can address if attempted with mutual respect, rather than competitive determination to prove righteousness that compromise could make irrelevant. Looking around at everyone here tonight, I realize this is exactly what we wanted. Our favorite people celebrating our marriage in a setting that feels like us, Sarah reflects, her observation revealing that inclusion and authenticity need not be mutually exclusive when creativity guides planning rather than limiting thinking to binary choices. And I've learned that being included doesn't require controlling every detail. Sometimes the most beautiful celebrations emerge from collaboration that honors different perspectives. Margaret adds, her growth evident in understanding that flexibility enhances rather than threatens meaningful participation when ego allows adaptation. The evening ends with promises about involvement in pregnancy and child-rearing that grandparenthood will require, plans for holidays that tradition and innovation can share, commitments to communication that prevents future misunderstandings from escalating into exclusion that love need not endure when wisdom guides choices about family relationships. 3 years later, Margaret watches her granddaughter take first steps in the same garden where reception had celebrated marriage that courthouse ceremony had begun, her heart full with recognition that families grow through challenges that initially seem destructive, but ultimately strengthen bonds when handled with grace rather than rigid insistence on predetermined outcomes that love transcends through patience. The wedding planning binder sits in closet now, its pages serving as reminder that love finds many forms of expression when hearts remain open to possibilities that compromise can discover between tradition and innovation, between individual authenticity and family inclusion, between past wounds and future joy that healing makes possible when forgiveness chooses connection over separation despite pain that growth sometimes requires enduring. The daughter-in-law who announced, "We got married yesterday," now calls regularly for parenting advice. Their relationship built on foundation that honesty had eventually created when trust recovered from deception through commitment to communication that relationship repair demanded and sustained effort had achieved, when all parties chose love over pride despite justified hurt, that grace had transformed into opportunity for deeper connection than original expectations might have provided if tested through adversity that revealed character more clearly than comfort could demonstrate, when souls choose growth over grievance in family relationships that forgiveness heals.